Hi everyone. Today's lecture really goes to the heart of TOK as we start to talk about what do we really know, and when we find out what we know, does it really do us any good? And the answer is yes and no, but we'll see more about that. TOK largely is going to be about how do we know when we can't always know that we know. As we've talked about with the knowledge equation, K equals JTB, there's this problematic thing of truth. When do we get truth? And, we don't know. But we have the knowledge equation to use, so we have to start here. So if we assume that the knowledge equation is right, that knowledge is a justified and true belief, but we also acknowledge that our main source of justification is perception, and perception, well, it's flawed. So how in the world do we get to knowledge? This lecture and this whole course is about that very question. Well, philosophy is about that very question. Philosophy is a big field. It includes many different items, including things like epistemology, ontology, theology, lots of ologies are included in philosophy. And at its core, TOK is a philosophy course, although my goal is to make the abstract ideas of philosophy come into real relationship with the world. And so a lot of this course is going to be about these bigger questions. How do we know what we know? How do we know that we know? How do we prove what we know? All of this is at the heart of what's called epistemology, which is what we're doing. But we're also going to be talking about what Bertrand Russell tells us in his book, The Problems of Philosophy, and I'm going to read it here for you. He says that philosophy is the attempt to answer ultimate questions, not carelessly and dogmatically as we do in ordinary life, but critically, after exploring all that makes such questions puzzling, and after realizing all the vagueness and confusion that underlie our ordinary ideas. I hope that you've already seen in this course we don't take anything for granted. Our job is to question everything, understand the difference between the map and the territory, as van der Langemat says, but also understand how even the flaws in the map are actually helpful to us. It's a long process. Stay with me. Speaking of the problems of philosophy, Russell's book, called The Problems of Philosophy, that's a great title for TOK. We are going to really be thinking about the problems of philosophy. And by problems of philosophy, Russell and other philosophers mean the complications of knowing. What stands in our way when we're trying to know something? To what extent can we really understand something? We're going to ask that question, to what extent, a lot. In TOK, instead of calling them problems of philosophy, we call these knowledge issues. So you'll see KIs a lot. And let's explore kind of a foundational KI or knowledge issue in a way that I think will help you understand what you've gotten yourself into in this course. One of my favorite questions to ask students is, can you prove to me that the desk exists? And we've talked about this a little bit already, but I want to break it down a little bit. Let's back up and think about the process that we would take to answer this question. If I were to ask you this question, you would give me really smart responses, like, I see the desk, or I can touch the desk. If I really wanted to, I could knock on the desk and hear. I could taste it if I really wanted to, though I don't recommend that. Also, if I'm sitting in the desk and it's holding me up, these things all indicate that the desk is likely there. What you're doing is you're depending on your senses. You're perceiving and determining that because you perceive it, it must be. By the way, that's a very famous philosophical theory called idealism. So well done. And that's almost always the first theory that students go to. But what if we leave the room? We're no longer seeing it. We're no longer hearing it. We have no access to it. Is the desk still there? And you would tell me, well, sure, the desk is still there. But what you're telling me is that you're no longer basing things on your own perception, on idealism. Instead, you're saying that these objects are real and external to us. They don't depend on us. They are outside of our beings. This is another complication. This is called realism. It's a little different. And we have to think about that. But what if we're being dreamed? And that would be a boring dream, I admit. But we've dreamed really, I guess, accurate-looking, real-looking dreams before. Could someone be dreaming us? My guess is no, we're not being dreamed, but can we prove it? And philosophers have time and time and time and time again decided, no, we can't prove it. Isn't that frustrating? So why am I doing this to you? Well, I'm doing it for a lot of reasons. One, it's just fun. But two, really, really smart people like yourselves have wrestled with these ideas for thousands of years. And they haven't been able to answer it really, really effectively in thousands of years. So we get to join into the conversation. I'm going to give you a couple of ideas of theories. A few minutes ago, I mentioned that the idea called idealism, and that is the idea of, I'm going to mispronounce this terribly, but esse a percipi, I think is how we pronounce that. But in English we would say to be is to be perceived. This is the idea of a man named Bishop George Berkeley. I know it looks like Berkeley, but it's pronounced Barclay. So Bishop Berkeley decided that if I can see it, if I can sense it, if I can perceive it, it's there. And he even had an out. If he left the room, his position as bishop gave him something extra. He said, hey, if I can't perceive it, God still perceives it. And if God perceives it, it's real. That's one attempt to answer these bigger questions. Most of you know about René Descartes, who is considered the father of modern philosophy. He came up with the idea of cogito ergo sum, in English stated as I think, therefore I am. If I am a thinking being, I am a being in existence. He went on to say, I may not be able to prove that my body exists because it is, after all, a material object, but I can prove that my mind, not my brain, but my mind exists, the thinking process. Therefore, I must really be. He also came up with the idea of systematic doubt, which is the idea that we should doubt everything until we can prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that it's true. That's really hard to do. You have to break down everything to believe that. Reuben Abel, whose book Man is the Measure we're reading, he came up with a different idea, kind of the opposite of systematic doubt. He calls it Abel's razor. This is not an official philosophical term, but it's kind of interesting to think about. He says, razors should not be thrown away as long as they give a fairly decent shave, even if they do not reach all the whiskers until you have a better one. And this is just a form of pragmatism. This is the idea that, hey, if your theory seems to work, go with it until you realize that you have something better. That seems like a good approach for us. So what other theories are out there? Well, we've talked about three of them. The correspondence theory that says that a statement is true if it corresponds to fact. The coherence theory that says a statement is true if it coheres with our overall previous set of beliefs. And the pragmatic theory, which is kind of like Abel's razor, which says a statement is true if it works in the world, if it helps us make predictions, helps us move forward. These are all very helpful, but as we've talked about in our Vandalagramot chapter 14, they're not perfect. So, again, they're theories and not necessarily facts, which is really frustrating. But we've got to know something, right? So what do we know? Well, some things that we know, again, we've talked about. The three laws of thought. Aristotle discovered these, or maybe he created them, we're not sure. We're not sure to what extent these laws are truly accurate, but they sure do seem to work. So again, in a pragmatic way, these are helpful. So these three laws of thought, first the law of identity, Abel describes it as everything is what it is and not something else. And again, duh. But that's really helpful because it lets us know that things must be themselves and not something else. Whatever is, so whatever exists, exists, and it exists as itself and not something else. It helps us categorize. The law of contradiction, which is also called the law of non-contradiction, Abel describes as the same attribute cannot both belong and not belong to the same subject at the same time and in the same respect. I think more easily stated, a proposition can't be both true and false at the same time. Again, we know that. That helps us say, hey, if this is true, then I know it's not false, and I can work the rest of my theory from that point. And then we have the law of excluded, also sometimes called exchanged middle. The law of excluded middle, according to Abel, says an attribute either does or does not belong to a subject, and again I think more clearly stated, a proposition is either true or it is false. It must be one or the other. The law of excluded middle says it must be one or the other. The law of contradiction says it's either one or the other and can't be both. And the law of identity says it is what it is. These are helpful in terms of categorization, classifying, but outside of that, not really that helpful. So we've come to the end of this lecture, and so far everything I've told you that we know really only helps us with organization. It doesn't necessarily help us prove that the sun is shining. It doesn't help us prove that I have a toothache. It doesn't help us prove that the desk in the middle of the room truly exists. It doesn't help us prove that you exist or I exist. This is really frustrating stuff. So, if we don't know we know any of this stuff, what are we to depend on? How can we prove or go about trying to prove? And here we go. We're back to perception. Oh, but it's flawed. What do we do? The thing is, what we have to do as humans, because we are flawed, we have to build our knowledge claims as objectively as possible from perception, which, of course, is subjective. This is frustrating. So, what are we really trying to do? Ultimately, perception helps us determine our relationship to matter. Where are we in comparison to where matter is? And by the way, we're matter too. Our bodies are matter. So, a lot of TOK is going to be about developing and explaining and understanding our relationship to objects, other things. 3 very important terms. Hopefully you've heard all 3 of them already by this point. Sense data, sensation, and matter. Sense data, very important term, you must know this. Sense data are things that are immediately known in sensation. In other words, like color, blue is sense data. I've drawn a conclusion about that. Or something feels cool. I've gained sense data. We've talked about protocol being the foundation of this. Protocol is without interpretation. It's perceiving without interpreting. Sense data is once we've started interpreting, we've drawn some minor conclusions. It's blue, it's rectangular, and so on. Then we have sensation, which is just the act of perceiving, or it's the process of gathering sense data. And then we have matter. Now, you've learned about matter in science class, but here we need to learn about matter in philosophy class. Yes, it is something that occupies space. Yes, it has a certain weight and size and so on. But more importantly, in philosophy, matter is incapable of thought. Matter is not mind. In philosophy, there is a big contrast between mind and matter, between what is physical and what is philosophical, and we're going to talk a lot more about that. We have a long way to go. Talk to you next time.